Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. My name is James Batchelor and today we are talking to Auto Trader about May 2021 being the strongest May on record for used car performance, and we'll also be chatting about other factors affecting the used car market at the moment. Now, joining me is Auto Trader's Chief Operating Officer, Catherine Faiers. Hello, Catherine.
Morning, James. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you on as always. Now, can we just start, please, with the data that you've just published about used car sales in May? I mean, as just a bit of an overview, can you just explain what you've been seeing?
Sure. So we track the data we specifically released is our view of where used car transactions trended in May of this year. And we track that based on a measure that we call proxy sold, which is driven by the number of cars, unique VRMs that we see being removed from our platform. And that suggests that the used car market was up about 15% in May, which for as long as we've been tracking the data would suggest that May was a record month. We've very much seen that in our audience data. We've seen visits consistently tracking up 25 to 30% year on year. The level of leads we're delivering to retailers has never been stronger, and it's great to see that translating through into the transaction data and volumes as well.
Yeah. Now, one stat that you mentioned in your release today is the amazing stat that there are 1.7 million lost transactions. I mean, that is a staggering figure, really, isn't it? I mean, could those lost sales actually be recovered this year, do you think?
Well, we certainly hope so. And with that analysis, we were trying to quantify the question that we get asked all the time is, demand looks really, really strong today. We ask consumers loads of questions through our research to establish some view of that sentiment going forward. But we were just trying to come at this from different ways and different angles to really size how much opportunity might still be out there. And to do that, we looked at the UK car park data back over more than a decade. And we then looked at the number of registration changes that there were typically in any given year, which actually gives you an average hold period for the typical UK consumer of about 3.5 years for a car. And that hasn't changed actually very much at all. It kind of bumps up and down, but is pretty consistently between 3 and 3.5 years. And what we saw last year during the pandemic was that increased up to 4.2 years, because clearly the market wasn't as accessible for consumers for many, many different reasons. Now, if the car park and that consumer hold period had still been turning at around 3.5 years rather than the 4.2 that we saw, there would have been 1.7 million more transactions across new and used car last year. And when we look at our consumer data and the sentiment we have, there's no reason to suggest that that whole period should have moved by 7 months in any of the data. So we do imagine those 1.7 million transactions, some of them will have been caught up, I'm sure, in May and already in June, but it does suggest there's a long runway and a number of factors that will underpin strong consumer demand for some time to come yet.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the data for May, I mean, are you as surprised as everybody else is that it's as strong as it is? Because I mean, the factors were all there that it was going to be strong, but it's still pretty surprising, isn't it? This level of demand is just so high.
Well, I think we were, because we'd seen the exit period of the last lockdown perform so much more strongly. So even back in March and April, we were still seeing transaction volumes that were up on 2019 data based on our view of proxy sold. So the market was already strong before and around the time that forecourts were reopening. I think this is what this 1.7 million number does, though. It puts that demand into some context. And if there are 1.7 million consumers that otherwise would have transacted, actually, it's not that surprising that we're seeing that level of consumer demand. When you then layer on everything we see in our research around this positive shift we've seen as well towards vehicle ownership as a result of the pandemic. So we've been asking the questions since March 2020 of consumers, how are you feeling about owning a car? Is it more or less important to you? And we're still today seeing 30% of consumers tell us it's more important. Equally, 10% of them are still in market to avoid public transport, our consumer confidence index, which asks the question around affordability and how comfortable are you in being able to afford your next vehicle relative to where you were a year ago. That's never been stronger. So whichever angle we come at it from, there are positive signs that actually demand should be strong and should continue to remain strong for the coming months.
Yeah. I mean, you make an interesting point there, because that's been I think has been one of the biggest surprises over the past 12 months, is that despite everything that's happened, consumers have remained confident, haven't they? And they've still been transacting, they've still wanted to buy cars, whether that's, there's a variety of factors that have been involved in that, but it hasn't gone away, the consumer confidence, has it?
Absolutely. And I think, we'll all have different views on how the government has and hasn't behaved over the last 18 months, but the level of support there's been for businesses, the furlough scheme, for many consumers, how they would usually use their disposable income on holidays, on going out, that percentage of income of expenditure, just hasn't been there for people, which does mean that actually, we've seen the savings data from the Bank of England, we've seen the consumer debt data, and it's never looked stronger. And one of, I think, the most interesting things we've seen on Auto Trader, we've seen this very positive sentiment shift overall towards people wanting personal access and exclusive use of a vehicle. The biggest shift we've probably seen is amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. And they were always the segment of consumers that, a lot of commentators in the industry were questioning, are they ever going to want to own a car? Are they passionate about vehicle ownership in the same way that generations that have come before them are? Well, we're now seeing about 500,000 more consumers in that 18 to 24-year-old age bracket on Auto Trader than we were seeing this time last year, which I think is really positive long-term sign of health for the industry. That one of the side effects of the pandemic for our industry is that consumer sentiment and confidence and desire to own or have exclusive access to a vehicle has never been stronger.
Yeah. And let's face it, once you've got into a car and you've owned that, you've got into the car ownership cycle, it's very difficult to take people out of that cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, now we've been speaking to lots of dealers over the past few weeks, from the big dealer groups to independents through to car supermarkets, and they've all been saying the same thing, really, which is, I mean, they expect this level of demand and these high prices to remain not just throughout the remainder of the year, but also well into 2022 as well. Again, is that a sentiment that you share?
Certainly, if you look at that 1.7 million transactions and you profile that out over, even taking into account what we've already seen in May, there's certainly a good runway for the next year within that to catch up that transaction data. In terms of pricing, I think you published our data earlier this week where prices are now up at 9.7%, 22 days to sell, which again are kind of all record-breaking stats and data from our side. Certainly, we've never seen a market that's looked or felt like this at Auto Trader. I think on the pricing side, we've got to hope, I think, and I think the market might actually be a little bit healthier if the sourcing side was slightly stronger, particularly the new car semiconductor issue, which many other people closer to the semiconductor manufacturers will probably be better placed to comment on. But certainly from all the manufacturers and retailers we talk to, that is going to be a material headwind, certainly for the next 6 months, and potentially, hopefully not, but potentially for longer as well. I think it's going to be interesting how much impact that supply side has on dampening consumer demand and the impact we see on where and how people are making those vehicle purchasing decisions. It's one of the things we're really trying to dig into at the moment, where there aren't new car options available for consumers. What steps are they taking? Are they delaying purchase? Are they substituting into used? Are they exploring different vehicle options that they wouldn't otherwise have been in market for? It feels like a segment that we need to understand and look to understand better, because I think it feels like it's going to be there for another few months at least.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point there, because it's affecting, as you'd expect, the semiconductor issue is affecting manufacturers in different ways at the moment. Some manufacturers are, for instance, in the world of commercial vehicles, it's really hitting them hard at the moment, whereas for some car manufacturers, they're expecting that to happen later in the year. So I think that this summer period and possibly into early autumn we're going to get a better feel of the state of the effects of all of that, really. Now let's just stick with pricing for the moment. Now, I mean, do you think dealers are actually keeping on top of what is? I mean, let's face it, it's a rapidly changing marketplace, isn't it? With prices going up all the time. Do you think dealers are keeping on top of these price movements and pricing stock accordingly?
First, I would say I think your point on how fast the market is moving and changing, and also for retailers, how much they've had to grapple with over the last couple of months, bringing people back from furlough on the 12th of April, remobilising, recreating the operations at forecourts, combined with what has been still a just phenomenal level of demand coming through digital channels. We're still delivering more than 50% more leads to retailers than we were in 2019. And so the volume of activities they've had to cope with, I don't want to underestimate at all, because it must have been operationally a very challenging couple of months. That said, we do still see in our data that retailers are leaving or are losing out on margin from not repricing vehicles to the market. And I think what repricing to the market means has changed fundamentally in the last few months, because I think it used to be fine to revisit the forecourt weekly, or some retailers would do it monthly, or ad hoc for some independent retailers. But now, with the level of movement we're seeing, almost every day in some cases we'll see what we would consider to be a material movement in a make, model, derivative. And so it is one of the messages we've been going out with very strongly to our customers in the last few weeks, to say, look, particularly for vehicles that you haven't repriced in the last week or so, go back round, have another look, because you might be surprised at how far the market's moved. Our valuations data that we publish is just based on retailer and auction observations. And so if retailers aren't reflecting where they think the market is in their valuations, then our valuations engine won't catch up fast enough to where they see the market being. So it becomes a bit self-fulfilling. So we do, and we would continue to recommend that retailers are revisiting pricing more often and making sure that they are making every pound of margin out of that vehicle possible.
Yeah. Now, as we open up a little bit more as we go through the summer, I mean, do you think there's a temptation for dealers to perhaps go back to some of the pre-pandemic days of working, where, for instance, not focusing on online sales, or not offering click and collect, for example, or even if customers want to transact in that kind of way? I mean, do dealers have to keep using the skills that they've learned in lockdowns in the future?
Well, our data would definitely suggest they do, because when you look at all of the research and all of the behaviours we're seeing from consumers, we're seeing in all of our research that consumers are now more than ever ready to complete more of the car buying journey online. The number of consumers now comfortable buying without a test drive, the number prepared to go much further through that part exchange journey to get through the inspection process almost to a guarantee online, is now their jobs that would have always been done on a forecourt, that consumers, because it's been our lived experience for the last 12, 18 months, are now much more comfortable doing. So there are a segment of consumers that are going to want to continue to operate in that way. And for retailers that aren't providing those solutions, that aren't offering those services, there will be some customers they will miss out on. The difficult thing, I think, is that we certainly believe that the future is omni-channel, that we don't see any time soon where we're going to get to a material percentage of consumers that are only going to buy online. For many, it's going to be a blended experience where they're potentially doing more online, more of the jobs are completed in a digital environment, but the forecourt is continuing to play a really important role. Not always with the jobs that we would associate the forecourt with, but in terms of the personalized customer service you can deliver, the support, the handover, still for some a test drive, those are all really important parts of the proposition. So for retailers, I think the job is going to be how you take the best of all of the forecourt and the forecourt experience that you can deliver, and combine that with the best that digital can bring to that customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. Now, finally, I'd just like to end on a more general point. It's something we've been reporting about a lot here at Car Dealer recently, and it's about agency sales. I mean, everybody's talking about it. I mean, from an auto trader's perspective, I mean, when do you see this sort of becoming perhaps dominant in the motor trade? And really, and this is a very difficult question to answer, I know, but how do you think all of this is going to affect the used car market?
So I think the thing that seems to have changed in the conversation in the last couple of months is it's moved from if agency sales will happen to when it will happen, which I think feels like a big shift in and of itself, because between VW, Mercedes, Volvo, enough of the manufacturers have come out and said, well, certainly for electric vehicles to begin with, that this is going to be their future distribution model. That seems to have slightly opened Pandora's box for some other manufacturers who are now, clearly engaging and beginning to talk to their networks about doing something similar. So I think for electric vehicles, it feels like over the coming months and years, that is going to emerge as the predominant distribution model. And for ICE vehicles, I think it will probably be more phased transition over a period of time. Clearly, some manufacturers have already come out and talked about stopping production for those vehicles. So it may be that there's a natural end date. So it does feel like for both manufacturers and for retailers that there's a huge amount now to be done in partnership with all sides collaborating and working together to figure out what that agency model should look like, how the incentives should work, how the different parts of the consumer buying journey are best supported by both OEM and by retailer. There's clearly, I think, positives and negatives for both sides for the model. I think some people are worried that part of what drives the entrepreneurship and the innovation that we see within retailers is the risk that is inherent with the operating model today. And retailers over years have built direct relationships with consumers and have been the principal point of contact for consumers in that car buying journey. And to imagine that manufacturers are suddenly going to be able to replicate that overnight feels incredibly ambitious. Then others are very positive, saying, well, if retailers, if I had a much more efficient balance sheet and my capital profile looked different, and I could actually focus on the higher margin value added areas of my business, then maybe actually my business would be better. And I think then there's probably every different variant of that in between. The challenge is that none of us really have, I think, the detail at the moment, and I'm sure that will emerge as we all work together to figure out what that new world should look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we're going to have to leave it there for today, I'm afraid, Catherine, but thank you so much for coming. Good to catch up, and great to hear about the May data. Thank you.
Nice to see you. Thanks, James.
Well, that's it for today's Car Dealer Live. Join us again very soon. Bye-bye.